In this episode, I talk about cognitive load and how this phenomena restricts us from being the best we can be. And I also talk about how we can try to overcome it, or in the journal spirit of this podcast, unlearn it. Let's dive right in. Hello, good people of the internet. Welcome to the Unlearning Playground, an everyday life podcast by Chetan Narang. In the previous episode, we talked about the fact that we see the world as we are, not as the world is. We discussed the three levels at which this is true. At the level of our moment to moment state of being, at the level of our biological conditioning, and at the level of our cultural, social, and rather psychological conditioning. If you haven't checked out that episode yet, I would highly recommend you to. And you can do that even after this episode. It is a good introduction as to why being aware of all of this is a big part of growing up and taking up the role of being a mature adult, which in turn is a big part of what we talk about here in this podcast. Now, in one manner of speaking, our decision making capabilities and our capabilities to really understand something or process something depend on a whole bunch of factors. And we are not always our best selves when it comes to any given moment. In this episode, we'll be discussing one such overarching phenomena which impacts a lot of our thinking capabilities at any given moment: cognitive load. Cognitive load is quite easy to understand actually. In purely layman terms, it is a measure of how much you have on your mind at any given moment. And it shouldn't be very tough to understand that this affects the quality of your state of being at that moment. Someone who is dealing with a whole bunch of things has a wide array of thoughts running through his or her mind at any given moment is obviously under a lot of load in one sense. A few things happen in such a state of mind which it can only benefit us to be aware of. Our ability to make good choices is not at its very best under high cognitive load, especially about the things not already in our mind. For example, if you are driving on a busy road, you are under a lot of cognitive load. The busier the traffic, the more the load. And the more the load, the more susceptible you are to being irrational in an argument if it starts with your partner who's sitting in the seat next to you. It might even distract you from even driving properly. Now, it helps the overall situation if both you as well as your partner become aware of this in that very moment and take whatever action seems rational then. Delaying the argument would be a good starting point, to be honest. This is applicable in general to so many avenues in our life, much more than what we would want to acknowledge. Whenever we have too much going on in our heads, we are more likely to not be our best selves, to not take criticism well, to not accept where we are wrong, to not consider that someone else who has an opposing viewpoint might have something right in his or her narrative. In short, we are more likely to be everything we ourselves do not like others around us being. So, in moments of high load, it helps to become aware of your own state of mind and understand that your decisions and your choices may be hampered. Taking a deep breath and delaying decision making unless you feel still and grounded again should be your plan of action, or rather, should be one of your plans of action. Also, it helps us to understand that a lot of times we might encounter a situation in which another person we are dealing with is under high cognitive load and hence they are not being their best self. and it helps the overall situation again to slow it down and delay decision making until the other person feels still and grounded again. Now, that is taking action from a place of compassion, from a place of love born out of understanding. Now, then, there is another phenomena which I want you to consider, and that is being in a state of high cognitive load for a long period of time, or what the average human calls a Wednesday afternoon these days. Well, surprisingly though, it is Wednesday morning when I'm recording this episode. Anyway, jokes apart, put your imaginative horses to work and picture for a minute that you have been working all day in your office. Meetings, discussions, firefightings, handling resignations, and also maybe a new joinee, avoiding a conflict with the manager, with the subordinates, your own project work, etc. All of this on the same day in a span of a few quote unquote working hours. Now, what do you think would be your state of mind at the end of such a day? You would be depleted, right? To say the least. You'd be exhausted. And what do you imagine your quality of decision making would be at such times? To put it lightly, let's just say you would not take your best decisions. This state of mind is what I understand to be ego depletion. Now, that term is a bit controversial in the psychological literature these days, but we're not using it to mean anything other than the state of feeling mentally depleted or tired. And like everything else we discuss here, that happens with me. That happens with you. That happens with those public figures we love or we love to hate. That happens with our managers, happens with our subordinates, happens with our partners, happens with human beings. It just helps us to be aware of ourselves, our own state of mind in the moment when this is happening, and also helps us to be aware when we see another person not being their best self. And in both these scenarios, it helps to take a deep breath and delay making decisions and drawing conclusions to the extent possible, of course, until you feel still and grounded again. You know, there is this very famous saying in Hindi, Khaali dimaag shaitan ka ghar hota hai. Loosely translated in English, it means that an empty mind is the devil's home. Now, when I started meditating and delving into my own psyche and my own thoughts a good few years ago, I remember that one of the first few startling revelations I had was that this quote is absolute garbage. Absolute garbage. Anyone who has ever experienced the state of having an empty mind knows what I'm talking about. Knows that it is an extremely calming and an extremely peaceful experience. If anything, it is the home of the divine, not the devil. The problem, of course, is that we never really get to empty our minds in our everyday lives, at least not these days. And if a mind full of rotten, incomplete thoughts, which is our default state by the way, suddenly has a lot of time at its hands, that definitely is a recipe for the devil. So, scared of this, what do we do under the disguise of practicality? We double down our efforts and we get busy with whatever it is our minds think is worth it. While what would have been more practical would have been doubling down the effort to try and really empty your mind. Try and ponder on the realizations that follow. You know, maybe we could even do a podcast episode together if you really tried it. Meditation is one practice that everyone should incorporate in their everyday lives. But we're all so busy these days with whatever swell things we have set out to achieve and keep ourselves busy with that almost everyone says that they simply do not have the time. And that always reminds me of an age old Zen proverb. It goes something like this: if you are so busy that you cannot meditate for 20 minutes a day, then you, my friend, should meditate for an hour a day. Now that's just lovely, isn't it? Because the busy person needs it much, much more than the free person. And that's just it. And to break it down for you, I talk about meditation in terms of the act of observing the flow of your own thoughts. For starters, you should try to allocate at least 20 minutes a day when you sit down, take some deep breaths, and do that. Just observe your own thoughts. That's it. That's the entire activity. And then, of course, keep consuming good, potent content to improve the quality of thoughts your mind ponders about. In our information age, it is really your own responsibility to filter out all the noise you receive otherwise by default. So, read more books, listen to better podcasts, follow better YouTube channels, declutter all the junk from your Instagram feeds, etc. You know the drill already. And of course, DM me on Instagram if you feel like having a word about any of it. I'm always open to honest and engaging conversations, like many of you have actually found out. The links to all of my socials can be found below in the show notes. Well, I guess that's it for this episode for now. I hope it found you in a state of relatively lower cognitive load so that you were able to understand it better. If not, I hope you find it in you to listen to it again and meditate on it. Until next time, peace out.